Okay, so when something goes wrong, a car crash, a medical mistake, the first thing everyone wants to know is who's to blame. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on how the law actually figures that out. And trust me, it's a fascinating process that affects all of us every single day.
Right? We've all been there. You see an accident happen and you can't help but think, oof, so who's on the hook for that? Well, the law has this surprisingly clever way of solving the puzzle, and it all hinges on one single, really powerful idea: a breach of duty. To really get our heads around this, let's jump into a real famous legal case. Imagine this. A cricket ball gets absolutely launched out of a stadium, something that's only happened a handful of times in decades, and it hits a random person walking by. The question for the court is simple. Was the cricket club to blame? And to answer that, the law pulls out a very specific and kind of strange tool. So that tool, it's not really a tool at all. In fact, the entire legal concept of negligence, of blame, pivots around one incredibly important and completely fictional character. So let's meet them.
This is it, the reasonable person test. You can think of it as the ultimate yardstick for deciding if someone screwed up. And the most important thing to get here is that it's an objective standard. The law honestly doesn't care if you were having a bad day, or if you genuinely thought you were being super careful. The only question it asks is, what would this imaginary, perfectly average, prudent person have done?
And believe me, this isn't some new idea. This quote, from a case way back in 1856, basically set the gold standard for negligence that we've been using for over 150 years. It's pretty simple when you boil it down. You're at fault if you do something a prudent person wouldn't, or you fail to do something they would. So, the bottom line is this: your personal feelings about what's safe or risky, totally irrelevant. The standard is completely external. It just strips away all our excuses and asks that one simple question: what would the reasonable person have done in that exact same spot? Okay, so how on earth does a court figure out what this imaginary reasonable person would have done? Well, they don't just wing it. They actually perform this delicate balancing act, weighing 4 key factors to see if someone's actions tipped over the line into legal blame. These are the 4 big things that go onto the scales of justice. They look at how likely it was for something to go wrong, how bad it would be if it did, how easy or expensive it would have been to stop it, and finally, whether the activity itself was actually good for society. Let's see how this all plays out. So let's kick things off with that first factor, the likelihood of harm. Let's circle back to our cricket ball case. The court had to figure out if it was probable enough that someone would get bonked on the head that the club should have done more to prevent it. Now just look at this number. This was the fact that the entire case turned on 6 times in 30 years. That's like once every 5 years. Is that a risk that you need to build a giant fortress to guard against? And the court's answer was a resounding no. They decided the risk was so incredibly small that the club wasn't negligent for not preventing it. And this teaches us a really key principle. The law doesn't expect us to guard against every single tiny, remote risk out there, only the ones that are reasonably foreseeable. But, likelihood is only one side of the coin. The court also has to ask, okay, what if that super unlikely thing does happen? How serious are the consequences? And that brings us to the second absolutely crucial factor. Think about this case. A guy was already blind in one eye. At his job, there was a small risk that a little metal chip could fly off and hit him. For most people, that's a minor injury. For him, the consequence was catastrophic, total and permanent blindness. This is where a legal idea called the thin skull rule comes in. Basically, you're on the hook for the full damage you cause, even if the victim was way more fragile than you expected. So what happened? Well, the court found the employer was negligent. Why? Because even though the risk was small, the potential harm was so unbelievably severe that a reasonable employer should have provided something as cheap and easy as a pair of safety goggles. The stakes were just too high. And those other factors get weighed too. Courts have said that the social value of saving a life means firefighters and take bigger risks to get to an emergency. And in another case, a court decided that the massive cost of shutting down a whole factory was just too much to prevent a small risk of someone slipping. It's always a trade-off. Okay, so this seems fairly clear, right? But what happens when the person causing the harm isn't your average adult? Does the law really expect a kid or someone just learning how to do something to have the same judgment as a seasoned professional? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because the standard actually adapts. A kid is judged by the standard of a reasonable child of their own age. A DIY enthusiast putting on a door handle is judged against a competent amateur, not a pro carpenter. But then, look at the learner driver. That's the real curveball here. The court made a tough policy decision to hold a learner to the exact same standard as a qualified driver. And why would they do that? It's all about making sure that the injured victim is always protected and can claim on insurance.
But what about the other end of the spectrum? What about professionals, like doctors? Of course, they're held to a higher standard. But how the law measures that standard has gone through this quiet revolution over the last few decades, and it has completely changed the power dynamic in the doctor's office.
For a long, long time, the rule was basically this. If a doctor could find just some other doctors who would have done the same thing, they were off the hook. It was a very doctor knows best kind of world. Then a case came along that said, well, hold on, that medical opinion at least has to be logical. But the real earthquake was in 2015 with a case called Montgomery. It flipped the whole thing on its head. Now, it's not about what doctors think you should know. It's all about what a reasonable patient would want to know before making their own decision. The power truly shifted from the doctor to the patient.
So, after all of this, the reasonable person, the balancing act, all these special rules, it all comes down to one thing: finding fault. But as we wrap this up, it's worth taking a step back and asking a much bigger question. Is this really the best way to help people who've been hurt?
This system we have now requires a victim to point the finger and prove somebody else messed up. But there is another way, used in places like New Zealand, a no-fault system. If you get hurt in an accident, you get support from a state fund, period. That whole expensive, complicated, and often really painful process of proving who's to blame is just gone.
Critics of our system say that this obsession with fault creates a system that is incredibly expensive and can drag on for years. And maybe worse, it creates what they call a compensation lottery. If you're seriously hurt, but you just can't find and prove someone else was negligent, you get nothing. If you can, you might get a huge payout. Is that really fair?
And that really leaves us with this one last crucial question to think about. Is the moral satisfaction of assigning blame really worth all the cost and the uncertainty? Or, as a society, should we maybe focus first and foremost on just helping those who've been harmed, no matter what? It's a huge debate about the very purpose of our justice system. Thanks so much for digging into this with me today.